Welcome to What's the Scenario with PLRB, where we explore claims and coverage scenarios relevant to insurance professionals. I'm Alissha Watling.
I'm Tim Havler.
And I'm Mike Brode.
All right, Tim, what's the scenario?
The insured's house in Rhode Island was destroyed by hurricane winds. Total loss. He had a standard ISO HO3 policy with standard replacement cost and coverage A limits of $450,000. Now the numbers are going to be important in this one. So again, coverage A, 450.
All right.
The adjuster investigated the loss, determined there was coverage, determined the ACV of the house was 200,000 and replacement cost was 400,000. However, the insured is a natural handyman, although his day job is an accountant, but he decided to rebuild the house himself from scratch, working diligently nights and weekends. Since he has a talent for this, it only ended up costing him 300,000 to completely rebuild the house on site, despite the original 400,000 replacement cost estimate. The insured presented the $300,000 figure to the adjuster, including receipts for materials he purchased. He did include a reasonable amount for his own labor too.
Mhm.
So it all is going to come down to a multiple choice question, and I will repeat the numbers. How much is owed for the dwelling repair? A, ACV 200,000. B, amount actually spent 300,000. C, replacement cost estimate 400,000. Or D, full policy limits 450,000. So we can all think about that one for a little bit, but in the meantime, I love these DIY questions because I am absolutely not a handyman, even though I've always wanted to be one. That's just not my thing. The hardest thing I've ever done is probably blinds and painting, and I did not enjoy it.
I'm with you. You hire people to do that. I don't want to mess up something.
Does make sense, but I've tried do-it-yourself kind of projects around. And do y'all want to hear a funny story about one of mine that kind of
Sure.
went sideways?
Yes, I do.
So, Ohio, you have basement, you have sump pumps. So probably the same in Illinois. Our sub pump went out, and so being the look at those hands, that handy person I am, I'm going to replace that sump pump. And this was years ago, and my oldest son was probably, let's say 5 or 6. So, what a wonderful opportunity to teach that young man that here's how you be a real man and repair your own stuff, right? So, what could go wrong? It's a sump pump. You pull the old one out, you put a new one in, connect it, voila, there you go. So, got the old one out. All right, we're doing good. Then we are connecting the new one, and you attach a little rubber hose between the PVC pipes to kind of marry the two so that your water safely exits the house. So, what one critical thing did I forget before we plugged in that?
To shut the water supply off.
Nope,
Ooh.
we're okay there. Checking to make sure that little rubber connector was tightened. So there's some hose clamps on there. So what happened was, I attached the two pipes, let my son plug it in, and then we're both kind of standing over the sump watching when, yes, the little rubber piece flies off, the pipes separate, and it starts spewing nasty rainwater over the both of us. So my son is traumatized. He went upstairs crying to mom, and there's dad covered in wet, nasty rainwater, contemplating life and how you try to teach somebody a lesson and then it all goes wrong. So I don't know that my son is ever, he's in his 20s now, if he'll ever try to do a DIY project, or we haven't really talked about how this might have impacted him trauma wise as a kid. But yeah, it was quite traumatic at the time. But of
I
course,
bet.
then dried off, I got it fixed and everything was good. But you're right. Sometimes it's cheaper just to go get an expert to do it.
An expert who
And you
knows.
don't have to do it.
And easier. Was it a finished basement?
No, thank goodness. So, yeah. I don't have your kind of money, Tim. So I'm finished.
I'm just picturing like the water spewing up and like covering you too.
It was pretty hilarious.
So, do we have to answer this question now?
Or do we have
We
a while to
do.
still think? Yeah, I'm trying to delay.
I
You
try to
guys don't like
delay.
these SAT style multiple choice
I
Right.
questions.
know. I did
What
not
do you
come
say,
here to take
Alissha?
tests, sir.
Whenever we come up with some kind of numbers or math issue, what do you say, Alissha?
How about this? We continue thinking of it as we go into the first question. That way, we may have a better idea of what the answer is afterwards.
Perfect. Good point.
You
Aha.
tried to fool me, Tim.
All right, let's work our way through it.
Okay, so do we have to consider the valued policy laws here, since it is technically a total loss?
Total loss, valued policy. 20 out of our 50 great states are valued policy states. And in those states, when you have a total loss, the insurance company, especially for residential buildings, has to pay the policy limits without any discussion because a lot of states have thought that some insurance companies might be valuing the houses a little bit too high and then collecting higher premiums, knowing that they'll only ever have to pay replacement cost. So to discourage that practice, they just say you got to pay the full coverage A limits. But fortunately for our purposes today, Rhode Island is not a valued policy state, so we can safely ignore that today. Rhode
All right,
Island doesn't always get a lot of love in these hypotheticals, but today we're
they
doing
get
Rhode
some.
Island. And yes, it does get hurricanes.
That
But
was going to be my question. Are you sure about that, Tim?
Looked that up on Wikipedia just to make sure, and yes, Rhode Island does get hurricanes.
Excellent.
all
So,
right,
Tim, you're
so
probably
how
going
about
to go back to asking us to do the
Yep,
math
you're not
here and
getting out of
come
this
up
one.
with all right. I'm
fine?
going to throw two out at you. How about this? Okay, because I think, and I don't know, it's been a while. Like I said,
Mhm.
I've moved into casualty because I didn't do well on property claim. But sometimes you pay ACV first, make sure your insured turns in all their particulars before you pay replacement costs. So my answer is going to be twofold, Tim. I'm going to pay 200,000 until I get some kind of guarantee that that work's been done, and then I guess I would pay him what it cost.
The
Right.
labor cost.
So
To
so
actually
Mike
repair the
says
place.
300 because he spent 300, even though he could have hired a contractor to do it for 400 and then you would have paid 400.
Well, I don't deal in hypotheticals.
Well, here's the thing: if I got insurance and I got a replacement cost estimate, why don't I just get the replacement cost estimate?
That's a good point. Why not get
Well,
the
maybe he
replacement cost
didn't.
money?
He wanted to do it himself because he thought he'd do a better job than the contractors who would have charged whatever. So for him, it wasn't even the cost. He just wanted to do it
He just
himself,
wanted to do
and
it.
he ended up saving the insurance company $100,000 by doing it himself. So, do we think it's fair that the insurance company gets to keep that money rather than sending it back to him?
Well, remember though, Tim, insurance is pooled resources from all of us who pay our premiums. So by keeping that dollar amount down, we all benefit by not having to pay increased premiums because we would have potentially overpaid that claim by 100,000 in your one scenario, maybe,
Mm.
That's a
if
good
that's right.
point.
Thank you.
So, okay, so and I'll add to that in a second. But first, we'll just go ahead and answer the question.
Are you sure?
The
I
answer
want
is
to
Yeah,
know.
I don't know. I think we kind of just beat this around for about another half hour and then we come up with the answer.
it's 300,000.
Aha.
And this
Ding,
is
ding, ding.
written right into the policy. It says you get
Cool.
the lowest of three numbers. You get the lowest of replacement cost estimate, how much you actually spent to do the repairs,
Mhm,
or the policy limits. So in here, that second one, how much you actually spent, is the lowest of the three numbers. So
mhm,
he's only getting 300 plus we'll include his labor too.
mhm,
Um, and this question about is that fair and the insurance company keeping the money, I think Mike is right that yes, insurance is pooled money. And I
mhm,
also think that it just goes to the nature of replacement costs that what you're trying to do is get the insured back into the position as if the loss had not occurred. So you give them replacement cost to make sure they can have a new house to live in. So
Hmm.
once they have a new house to live in, they don't necessarily need more after that, and that would kind of just be a windfall for
Right.
them.
You shouldn't profit from an
Correct.
insurance loss.
Correct.
Okay. So he's only entitled to he gets the $300,000.
He gets
That's
the
what he spent.
300,000. That's what he spent.
That includes the labor.
We can probably include labor. We would include labor for a contractor, so we could include his labor too. After all, he spent it. He spent his money and he spent his time.
Right. That's fair.
But does that include, like, say, a hypothetical contractor's overhead and profit?
I said we don't deal in hypotheticals here, Alicia.
We have to address all areas. So
All
we're going
right. Good point.
hypothetical right now.
Every
Okay.
angle, Mike. Every
Right.
angle.
Good point.
Overhead, probably for what is overhead for a business? It's your rent, your heating bill, your light, your power, your I don't know, your insurance
Employees.
premiums,
Yeah.
yeah, administrative,
Mhm,
travel, all that kind of stuff.
mhm,
So, um, but for a homeowner doing his own repairs, what would that overhead be? I mean, maybe if he had extra electricity bills or a lot of trips to Home Depot, but I don't
mhm,
know how much that would actually add up to. Um,
In
I
my
wouldn't
case, it might
necessarily
have
rule
been
it out, but you could consider it.
mhm.
because, like in my scenario that I gave you all with the sump pump, that overhead could have been counseling for my son for the trauma that he went through.
Consequential loss.
Okay.
Mhm,
Labor seems fair, overhead and profit.
mhm.
Well, overhead maybe, profit's a big stretch.
Gotcha.
How about this one, Tim? What if our insurer just kind of, this might be tough for an accountant, but let's say this is the one accountant that didn't keep good records and like didn't keep his receipts from all the lumber that he bought and the nails. And he just said, we'll figure it out later. Didn't have any of the receipts. You out there see that the home was rebuilt, but he didn't have all the particulars to add up to that $300,000. What would happen then, Tim? Huh? Riddle me that one.
Well, one court from New York held against the insured because he
Ooh,
couldn't provide any documentation. Now, for that was a self-repair case. I don't know that every court would go that way. We're in Rhode Island, so a Rhode Island court can look at a New York court and say, okay, that we can consider this, but it doesn't bind them. And
Mhm,
I would also make a comparison to just a normal contents claim. Well, I mean, Mike, I'll put this to you. If
oh,
someone had a big contents claim and didn't have any receipts for it.
yeah,
I
we would
mean,
do our best to figure out what the costs of those items were, the best description we could get of them. And same thing, I think usually an insurance company isn't just going to wash their hands of the whole thing until they insured to figure it out. They're going to have some kind of an estimate of what they think the place would have cost to rebuild. So they would probably have some kind of documentation that they could go on to know what labor costs are, what lumber costs are, what nails would cost, what it would take to rebuild the place. So I think there's some nuance way that we could negotiate something had this accountant not kept all of his documentation. But again, the person's an accountant. He's definitely keeping track of all this stuff. There's no
that's a
no
good
question about
point.
that.
That's a good point.
Well, maybe he's a do as I say, not as I do kind of
Ah,
accountant.
there you go.
Uh, well, I think we can negotiate with him.
Right.
All right,
Mm,
so I have a question. Say Mr. Accountant Handyman is so good at building and finding deals and getting his labor costs or materials costs down, and he only spent like $150,000 rebuilding the house. Does that mean once he puts in all the receipts, he only gets $150,000?
Okay, so if we go back to the lowest of those three numbers, uh-oh, now the lowest of those three numbers is 150
Right.
Mhm.
because that's what he actually spent. So is he now only getting 150? And the answer is no,
Oh,
Oh,
because
huh?
at a bare
What?
minimum, you can always ignore replacement cost and just make your ACV claim. Because Mike, you said like right off the bat, you gave this guy ACV
Right.
and then you gave him extra once repair was complete. So he
mhm.
could just say, forget replacement cost, I'll make an ACV claim. So he still get 200. in that case.
Okay.
Interesting.
That's cool.
So he must have found some really interesting
He
building
went to the
materials
woods
on
and
sale or
chopped his
something.
own wood and
Right. His own
Down the
sawmill.
forest.
Anything to get that $50,000.
He's
Yes.
a real
he's basically in the wrong profession. He should just be a professional house builder and not an accountant. All right, so another weird question. He wants to move from his current location because he's like, I ain't trying to get hit with a hurricane again.
Done with Rhode Island.
Done.
Yes.
Oh,
Can
yeah,
I
okay.
build somewhere else? A new house, different location.
Okay, so we're going to give him 200 right off the bat because that's ACV.
Hmm.
Now he wants to rebuild in Ohio because not too many natural disasters in Ohio, and
Oh, you'd be surprised, Tim.
and he wants the extra. Say he buys a house now he buys $1 million house in Ohio,
That sounds like a him problem.
and now he wants the extra, so he wants up to 450 because that's the coverage A limits.
Hmm.
Okay, I think it's okay to replace rather than rebuild. We can still think about giving him the holdback, but we still have to. Now we're back in those three numbers. So now we got to look at the lowest of the three numbers.
Hmm.
Amount actually spent $1 million. Coverage A limits 450, and hypothetical replacement cost estimate on same location
Hmm.
300.
Hmm.
So, yes, he can get up to 300 here, but just because he spent a million doesn't mean he's getting a million or 450. You can't ever get more than what it would have cost you to rebuild on site.
Gotcha.
And the other thing I'd say, he can't buy a factory and say that's a replacement for his home. It has to be something that replaces his living situation.
A residential building.
Even if it's $1 million, that's a replacement for a
Mhm.
$400,000 house.
What if it's a former factory that he turns into his home?
I would want to know that he's really going to do it.
All right. So, Tim, what can we take away from this scenario?
To recap, our homeowner had a total loss by hurricane in Rhode Island. Standard ISO HO3, ACV 200,000, replacement cost 400,000, policy limits 450,000. The insured rebuilds by himself, no contractor, saving money and only spending 300,000. The insured would be entitled to the lowest of those numbers, which is $300,000, which is what he spent.
Mhm.
Labor can be included, so can overhead probably, but I doubt profit since his profession was not a contractor and he didn't lose any personal profits doing it.
Mhm.
Okay, so Mike, where
Yes.
can we learn more about this topic on PLRB's website?
Well, of course. Well, there you hit it. That's where I would go first, to
Mhm.
plrb.org and check some things out. I do believe here, Tim, we would have some cool stuff, coverage questions on would a do-it-yourselfer, would they be entitled to their own labor? We have things on ACV versus replacement costs as a do-it-yourselfer, as well as policy annotations that cover all replacement cost loss settlements and other details that you can find at our fabulous plrb.org website.
Groovy. And you can find all of that in the recap of these key points in the show notes of
Uh,
this podcast. So you can also find links to our social media. You can find information on how to submit your own adjuster story that could be read by one of us. So don't forget to subscribe. Don't forget to rate us. And we'll see you in the next scenario. Bye, guys.
Yay! Bye for now.
Bye.
The views and opinions expressed in this resource are those of the individual speaker and not necessarily those of the Property and Liability Resource Bureau, its membership, or any organization with which the presenter is employed or affiliated. The information, ideas, and opinions are presented as information only and not as legal advice or offers of representation. Individual policy language and state laws vary, and listeners should rely on guidance from their companies and counsel as appropriate.